welcome welcome all to the first after lunch panel on Sunday at EGA 2017. Woohoo! We're here. This is Rakrazam, and this is the panel Gurunation, Shamans in a Global Village. So we're going to be discussing, the other side of what happens at EGA in terms of psychedelics, which is the entheogens. And as the medicalization of man-made compounds comes more and more into the scientific paradigm once more psychic spaces arise and more activation is happening on a community level with people who are partaking of the plants and animal psychoactives that indigenous peoples all around the world have been caretakers for. And there seems to be, in my little big picture, a global shamanic resurgence happening. And so this experiential, hands-on relationship with the plants and with the spaces they reveal seems to be coming full circle back into our culture. And with that, of course, comes the growth spurts and the ups and downs and the supply and demand of a spiritual practice. So we're here to discuss the ins and outs and some of the big picture and the little details which make up this shamanic resurgence. And with me here today are a fine assemblage of hearts and minds.
Fine, if motley.
If motley. Well, let's start at the end, and just a very brief introduction from Mr. Neil Pike.
Okay, I'm just an adult old drug-fucked hippie, really, but I've been doing a lot of this stuff a lot longer than many of the people you've heard speaking today, and I'm just going to state I'm also one of the originators of the word Gurunation. Now, probably some of you interpreted that as a nation of gurus, but no. Gurunation is the act of gurunating over a bunch of stupid, gullible white people. And that's my basic position on shamanism. So I'm the devil's advocate here, right? I just think it's spiritual colonialism of the lowest order to call yourself a shaman when you're not part of a long indigenous tradition. And that's basically the main reason I'm on this panel, I suspect.
My name's Steve McDonald. Can you hear that? Can you hear me? Yeah? Cool. I'm here to counterbalance Neil, I think. I'm very interested in the evolution of human consciousness, and I've studied a bunch of developmental psychology research informally over the years. And I'm interested in psychedelic healing, and I have a background in that. And I'm also, I speak publicly often about how society is evolving and how values are changing. And so I guess that's one of the main perspectives I bring to this discussion is, what's a natural evolution of a healing process with psychedelics? From a big picture point of view.
Hi, my name is Rachel Gagan. I'm a Western herbal medicine practitioner, and I work with entheogenic medicine, specifically Iboga, and I think I'm here to break up the masculine energy on the panel.
I'm James Oroc, author, journalist. I wrote the book Tryptamine Palace. I have a new book coming out called The New Psychedelic Revolution, and I'm probably on the panel because I have more of a mystical perspective than a shaman's perspective.
I'm Joe Tafur. I'm a medical doctor, and I have a book out. And I trained in ayahuasca shamanism in the Amazon under traditional Shipibo, in a lineage of traditional Shipibos. And I was at a healing center where we offered that traditional training to non-Shipibos regularly.
Thank you, panelists. So let's continue on this trail of thought that Neil has started. So, what is a shaman? And what is a shaman with lineage? Because essentially, this comes back to like anthropology and Mircea Eliade and the classic book Shamanism as the archaic techniques of ecstasy. But in his, condensation of all the practices around the world, essentially there are medicine men and women with different practices engaging with trance, with dance, with energy activation, with psychoactive plants. There's many different modalities, but they alter consciousness, and essentially the role they seem to fulfill in tribal societies is that of a healer, a mediator, an energy worker, sometimes almost aspects of the priest or the storyteller, the showman. There's a lot of facets to this role. And when we've, packaged this up in sort of a nice, neat Walt Disney overtones, in the West, it really seems to fill the gap of medicine. Well, it fills the gap of sorcerer and magic and all those archetypes that we killed off in our culture, that we ruthlessly exterminated in most of the indigenous cultures we came across, and we left a vacuum. So what does this idea of shaman mean in the 21st century? Does anyone want to take a crack at that?
Okay, I think there's this expression the old anthropologists used to have, which is called exotification, which is that, like, basically people that don't have a culture tend to latch onto any other culture that's other, that's not them, that's not their culture, because it's so wow, And I see huge elements of that running right through this scene. I've seen it the whole time. Now, shamanism, what is shaman? As you say, it's a role that is occupied by one individual within a community, usually. They're often outsiders. They're often not that well liked, or everyone's a bit scared of them because they're often crazy as 10 loons because they've gobbled so many fucking substances. But their role is as an intermediary between the universe and the average punter, as I understand it. I might be corrected by someone who's actually studied with shaman.
Yeah.
But as a healer as much as anything else, as a doctor as much as a psychologist or a priest, because let's face it, the Catholic Church occupied that role for a long time, didn't it? An intermediary between God and us. So I don't know, as far as shamanism goes, I think personally we can learn an awful lot from all the traditions from all around the world, but we just have to be so careful that we don't do what our culture has always done, which is just commodify, co-opt, and then sell back to each other, which sort of is what I see happening right across the globe, particularly in the Amazon region, as I understand it. So I should really let somebody else talk.
I mean, I would say without it, there are obviously exceptions, but it's probably the most abused and misunderstood word in our culture. In Jeremy Narby's book, The Cosmic Serpent, there's an excellent chapter where he points out that basically we just project our own needs and wants on this mysterious figure, and it's anthropologically it's sort of mirrored the crises that anthropology itself has gone through, and I think our culture does a bit of the same. As Rack says, we're lacking a certain figure, so the shaman has become this romanticized idea of the psychedelic teacher, and that's a very complicated thing in itself. We can sort of blame Terence McKenna for a lot of it. But I think, I think the way we view shamanism is rather naive.
I would say that, so there's what's happening, I guess, in the entheogenic community and these neo-shamans and all that kind of stuff that's rubbing people the wrong way, or some people are getting rubbed the wrong way by that. But as far as what that role is and has been in all human culture all over the world, including like ancestral European culture, right? As far as we know. So it's just a very common role. And so it's this idea of someone, and it's different. They have different ways of describing because there's so many different forms of it. So it's hard to generalize. So we use shaman, this Siberian term. Yeah. The Shipibos have their own word for that, and the different stages of it. Just like any field, any practice, it's so much more diverse than anything that we could just kind of like blanket. So I would just talk about like Shipibo shamanism as it's been described that I've been working with, and as far as what are shamans like, and there's all this anthropology and there's all this, this is how they are or whatever, this kind of other treatment. But like someone that lives with shamans, like the ones I live with and work with, who are okay with being called shamans, aren't crazy, and no one, they might be a little, but they have families and they hang out with everybody, and they're not schizophrenic and all the stuff the anthropologists and the books, and the kind of very foreign perspective like has towards them. And, in other words, who has actually talked, hung out with, lived with, trained with these people to actually say, what are they like? Like some of the people here I'm actually getting to know them as human beings. So these are human beings. And then in the traditional sense that ultimately, because there's no bureaucracy behind it or paperwork or blah, 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 it's the community that defines the role of the spiritual healer. So no one is going to say, I'm a spiritual healer. The community is what gives them that designation. In other words, you're going to find that people say, oh, you need this kind of help, go find that person. He helped my sister. He helped this person. So the community, it's not a self-proclaimed thing to say you're a spiritual healer. It doesn't mean anything. You know, you need a track record, and that's kind of the key to putting yourself into the world as a medicine person.
If we look back over history and human evolution, our eras tend to swing between an orientation on community and an orientation on individuality. And when we're in the individual stages, then our tendency is to want to change the world outside of us to fit with what we need. And when we're in the communal stages or eras, our tendency is to want to change ourselves by going deep inside to fit with what the world needs. And so mainstream society is currently, and I'm talking about global society here now, where if you take an average globally, we're in transition from an individualistic stage, which has been the modern scientific industrial era, towards a new communal stage, which is essentially a new version of humanity which is emerging. Just as years ago we transitioned from the agricultural era, where we first learned to plant large-scale crops and so we could start to live in towns and cities, and that shifted from that community orientation into the modern lifestyle that we all know too well and which is starting to fall apart right now. So as we move back to the community way of being human, which is relativistic or postmodern or pluralistic, it's very much centred this time around human values and deep human connection. So it's very network-centric, and it's also quite technologically influenced as well. But when we've spent, in this case, we've spent 300 years or more living life according to the scientific industrial way, we need to somehow recover the concept of how to live in community when we swing back the other way, as we're doing right now, okay? And the most common human tendency during those times is to look back to old times and remember, what was it like to live in community? You know, what was it like to live in community during that agricultural era? What was it like to live in community during the traditional tribal eras, which go even further back? And so it's quite normal and usual for us to look back for solutions that we can apply now, and that is obviously what's happening, where we're looking to traditions that have endured throughout the ages and they've held some sort of tribal practice and altered state practices, and then learn those and learn how to adapt those to the present day. And so what we've got going on right now is quite a spectrum of practice. Some people who are just trying to imitate what happened in traditional tribal societies, albeit as an outsider, right, but not coming from within the tribe. Other people who are taking a religious approach, like the Brazilian churches, for example, who are working on an agricultural era kind of mindset of a structured church that's got a book of rules and a God. And then other folks who are trying to take the best of those historical practices and adapt it for the present day, which is resulting in the emergence of something new. And I just want to make a quick comment about the term shaman. I don't like to use that term, and I don't think it particularly applies to the present day and what's going on, because it's an old term historically, and it comes from a very different set of life conditions than we are exposed to today. But I think it's fair to say that every human being has the capacity to heal themselves, and every human being has the capacity to have interdimensional awareness, okay? Some people have a more natural tendency than others. Some people have learnt how to do it before other people have. So just as in every other walk of life, some people are going to fall more naturally into that role of helping other people discover how to heal themselves, or to discover how to operate in a multi-dimensional space. And those are the folks who are going to naturally be drawn towards doing this kind of work.
Thank you, Steve. I think you're right, and to draw upon what Neil was saying at the start as well, is like in the 60s when we had the Psychedelic Revolution, there weren't elders in the West of altered states to a large degree that were visible and could help with the anchoring of that experience. So they outreached to the East and looked at India and mysticism and things like that, and the whole guruization happened. But, when young children are learning how to be functional, they learn from entrainment and they learn from those around them, and there needs to be some imprint. And if the lineage isn't there, there's a natural outreaching to try to imprint and to try to learn. And so in this next generation we've had in the noughts, where ayahuasca has been really proliferating around the world. There is, an established lineage and different traditions around South America, and there's been the idea of ceremony and ritual and structure that's been brought to the re-energized role of the shaman. But beyond that, I think the difference is there's this resensitization happening with these substances that draws us back. It's medicine, like it's planetary medicine from Gaia, which doesn't necessarily need that middle person, but if we don't have the village and if we don't have the structure, there needs to be some mediation as this sort of Gaian inoculation rolls through culture again. So it seems to me one thing to keep an eye on is that the role of shaman, or the evolving role of the shaman, is like a process. It's not just a set role with a set healing capacity. It's like a guardian of these portals and caretaker for that space to bring people into a larger process that's underway that seems to be very necessary. And within that, there's a lot of diversity. So maybe I'd like to throw that to Rachel and to see, Rachel, what do you think, what do you think the role of Iboga has been playing in that planetary medicine tribe, and what are the specifics perhaps of facilitating, or the differences between, the more archetypal shamanic role or the facilitator role in that space?
Yeah, I'd say there's a clear difference between the role of a shaman and the role of a facilitator, where the role of a shaman doesn't really translate over into our secular Western society. I don't think we really have a context for it. But the role of a facilitator and a guide, of somebody holding space for you to do your own inner work, because we're quite a self-empowered society, does translate. And so I think the word shaman, I don't think it really translates into our society. The shamanism has always evolved inside a community, and we don't really have a very developed sense of community in the West. It's so disjointed. I think we'd be approaching it from a pretty spiritually deprived place. I'm not sure more of the question.
Well, I mean, there's differentiations, as you say, between facilitator, sitter, provider, facilitator, shaman, perhaps. Yeah. Does anyone want to comment on perhaps that spectrum of space holding and the participation that role may engender with people undergoing shamanic experiences?
Well, one of the things about shamanism that we generally don't talk about in this culture is that it involves sorcery. You can't extradite the practice of shamanism from the practice of sorcery. You have black magic, magic darts. There's a whole yin and yang aspect to shamanism where we tend to just try and take the nice bits that we want and ignore the rest of it. And like these guys are saying, it doesn't really fit to the current model. I think we project on this idea of what we want. The thing interesting about psychedelics is it seems that there is a large community that wants a genuine spiritual reconnection, and psychedelics have given us a taste of that. So then we go down that path, and we hope that the shaman figure is somehow more and maybe enlightened than the rest of us and can help guide us towards this enlightenment that's really, as Rachel said, an inner progression. People ask me, what kind of references and things do you have for being a facilitator or a sitter with 5-methoxy-DMT? And I tell them to read the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, Sogyal Rinpoche's book, which is what the hospice movement uses a lot. And the kind of training you are given for hospice work is exactly the kind of training that you want for working with something like 5-methoxy-DMT, because the whole point is not to put your experience on top of somebody else's, just to create space, make sure they're safe, and allow them to find their experience. That's what I find, especially with the neo-shamans, as they were described earlier, that I find distressing, the things I see online and the reports I hear of people getting waterboarded and shocked and raped and doing all these things that to me just takes you out of the experience, doesn't leave you. The whole goal is to leave you in the experience for as long as you can. And people that think that they can manipulate the experience, I think, are looking at it from a very egotistical perspective.
Maybe I'll just comment that I guess sitter, facilitator, and then what is a shaman? What is that? So first, like, well, I'm working at a healing center in Peru where we're pretty much treating exclusively Westerners who respond readily to these indigenous shamanic techniques. It's not a culturally specific response. It's no problem to interact with them, although they're Westerners, and to try to help them and for them to have experiences directly related to what Shipibo's experienced during the ceremony. So, but the shaman traditionally within the cultures, start like Maria Sabina, for example, when she was the psilocybin issue and people were coming down, and that was a healing ceremony. That was for healing. It was for medicine. In other words, this person is not necessarily regarded as a sage or a saint or someone who's enlightened or knows more than someone else. It's somebody who is skilled as an artist in working with spiritual energies and healing energies, and somehow to facilitate that healing process with another individual, which once again is not a self-proclaimed thing. You have to talk to the patient, and that's the one reporting back, wow, this is what happened to me. So in other words, the only person that's making it up is the person that's saying, wow, that person just healed me or helped me heal myself or whatever that is. So that's the reality of like the real treatment and the real tradition. It's based on actual results. It's not just talk. And so Maria and Sabina said, when people started coming down, and then they started coming down because they said, show us about God. We want to use the mushrooms to learn about God. And Maria said, we don't do it for that. Like, if you're sick, we do it. We don't do it for that. Like, you guys are confused. You guys are trying to take this in another direction. And the shamanic tradition in the Amazon is also very medically oriented. In other words, you're doing it for healing, to heal the sick. That shaman who may be very, very skilled in working with spiritual energies, which at the first time that you witness that under the effect of ayahuasca, you may deify them because it's so surprising to see what seems like a paranormal phenomenon that somebody would learn to engage. It's just the way somebody could learn to play music to electrify this whole crowd. That's like, it's a wow moment, and they become a rock god or whatever. But really, that person's skill is in helping facilitate this healing process. It's not necessarily that they're any more enlightened or they know more about life than anyone else. And that's not like the discussions that we have after the ceremony are about that, about their healing process. It's not about all these questions to him, what is the nature of reality, or et cetera, et cetera.
Can you give us an example of some of the kind of ailments that are being healed?
Well, I have a book describing, the kind of ailments that are the focus of why people come down there and what they're getting help with. And the first is the mental health issues of anxiety and depression and PTSD, and associated to that is addiction. And then we see a lot of psychosomatic illness and manifestations of some physical illnesses that definitely have a psychosomatic component. And my argument is that a lot of the effectiveness is in things that are emotionally rooted that may have mental or physical effects.
Wouldn't you say at that point it's becoming kind of a syncretic treatment? Because I would think that those ailments are not really the sort of ailments that Amazonian tribes people would ever suffered from.
But this keeps coming up all the time, and I know this whole thing of like, what's the tradition and it's like, actually people are actually alive right now in 2017. They're not like the one from the photo that you saw somewhere. There's one walking around. And so in other words, syncretic, it's like, my point is like, I don't go to England and complain that everyone's not speaking Shakespearean English.
Well, no, my point is more that you're dealing with different kind of ailments that what shamanism would have traditionally dealt with.
That's not true from a shamanic perspective, because the shamanic perspective is treating that person in their framework. In other words, they're going to say, this person has this energetic problem, this spiritual problem that you're calling anxiety, you're calling depression, but they see it in a functional sense and are able to work with it and help that person come through that.
I can believe that. It just seems that those ailments are themselves modern ailments that we're transposing under that system.
I don't see the relevance of that distinction.
When I first went down to the Amazon, both Don Francisco Montesuna and Guillermo Aravello both said to me that they were seeing more and more Westerners, and that there's the physical ailments and there's the psychological things, but essentially a lot of people were wanting the visions because they didn't believe, and they had this sort of like disconnect from nature and from that sense of belonging, and that people were sick, but not in any way that they would have put their finger on, but there was a dis-ease in the Westerners coming because they weren't connected, and they were really wanting that sense of connection. And so maybe you're both right. I don't know.
Well, ayahuasca is an interesting example. I'm one of a few people who doesn't particularly think ayahuasca is supposed to be psychedelic. There are over 80 different ayahuasca cultures scattered throughout the Amazon. They all use the vine, which contains the beta-carbolines. Not all of them use DMT components. The Yahe of Colombia had no DMT in it whatsoever. And if you actually read the early reports of the first Westerners who tried ayahuasca, nobody really has much effect. Richard Evans Schultes, colours and squiggly lines. Terence McKenna, when they went down there in the 70s and went looking for it, all the times they tried it, it didn't really work. It wasn't until they took bottles of it back to America and took much more than the shaman was giving them that they got the effect that Terence was looking for. Now, when Westerners started turning up in the Amazon, willing to pay $70 to $100 for this experience, the DMT component has been cranked up in all the brews. It really, the DMT of the Iquitos area in Peru was heavy in chacruna, which is the leaf that contains the DMT. So once the other cultures and other tribes realized that this is really what the Westerners were looking for, you now have that is infiltrated all over the Amazon and outside of the Amazon. They also put Tohei, Datura in some of the brews to help you with the visions. So once, I personally, I think that there wasn't a lot of DMT component in it. Some people were more susceptible to it. There were reports of it. William S. Burroughs in the Yahe letters, he does it first in Colombia, and it's a very non-distinct, lumpy kind of an experience because the Yahe of Colombia didn't have any DMT in it. Then he goes to Iquitos and he has the breakthrough psychedelic experience. Now, I think I have no problem with ayahuasca being used as a psychedelic. I just think that we should be honest with ourselves what we're doing and why we're trying to do it, and not try and wrap it in this cultural wrappings that we're healing ourselves or that these medicines are involved, because we're on a different track with the way we're using it, in my opinion.
What are we doing then, James, if we're not healing ourselves? Can you explain?
We're exploring the spiritual, and for some people there's a healing in that, but I don't think it's all about. I think most people that go to ayahuasca circles are not trying to heal themselves. They're trying to have a psychedelic experience.
But wait a sec. This is the underlying thing. There's a surface reason. What is healing? What is connection? What is true knowledge of what you're embedded in? But this is what I'm saying. Most Westerners would go down to Peru not realizing they're sick, but the curandero has said to me they are sick because they can't see the reality for the forest, right?
Let's face it, most Westerns would go down.
We get into a whole lot of semantics.
No, it's not semantics. It's the underlying fundamental thing that we are distanced from nature so much that we even see the plants as separate from ourselves. We're not connected into the Gaian intelligence. We're separate from it.
So all humanity is sick.
Yes, to varying degrees, all of humanity is sick because it doesn't remember its true original nature of union with the source and with interconnection with nature. We've forgotten our place in the web of life. We've become a cancerous virus going across the planet, taking all the resources and destroying what we're embedded in. This is the underlying sickness, which the global shamanic resurgence, which connects to all the secretions of Gaia, which psychoactively bring us back into the web, right? It's mediation of the species. I'll give you goo, buddy.
If I could say something.
Go ahead.
I think that it's inherently impossible to divorce the therapeutic, the recreational, and the medicinal use of these entheogens. They are one and the same. So the visions and the psychedelic qualities, maybe, to be honest, we're getting high and we really love that, but that is therapy in itself, and that is healing in itself.
It's just such a slippery slope when you got every hippie walking around Burning Man with pockets full of 2CB and GHB and everything else going, oh, let's do some medicine.
I mean, if you want to reconnect with Gaia, go out to a fucking cow paddock and whoop and eat some mushrooms, You'll get the same program. And if you want to pay me $50, I'll come over and wave a feather over you.
Well, it's about results, you know what I mean? It's about results. So you can, poo-poo like ayahuasca shamanism, but then it's like, I don't know, there's people flocking over there. I guess they're all confused, they're all idiots, but a lot of them are walking away really healed. And so, in other words, there's actually some legitimacy to the tradition and what these people are learning and training. In other words, there's something beyond perhaps what people who are one generation into psychedelics Like there might be more possibilities than you might be aware of what can be done with that energy. And so that's what's going on right now. And so in the Amazon, there is a lot of visionary, like there's pure DMT snuffs. There's ayahuasca is the visionary side of ayahuasca is central to all the traditions of talking about the visions and everything, and all the tribes. They may have varying degrees of how much DMT they use. You know, I don't think in the time of William S. Burroughs, they were adjusting their ayahuasca cooking to gringos arriving, you know. Then William Spruce in the 1880s was the first one that inspired Richard Evans Schultes to go down and said, yeah, he had a visionary. He's like, the properties of the Yahe were verified. This is a magical experience in his experience. So the visionary component is been around through the Amazon and the use of the Brugmansia and the use of all these other things and just pure DMT snuffs. I mean, they're into visionary experiences. They don't claim that the visionary experience is the healing experience. They don't claim that. Okay, it's part of the experience. And so that's overstated, the healing that can be done just by taking pills and drugs and blah, blah, blah. We're not seeing the kind of results from people taking MDMA at the rave that we're seeing with the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trial. Simple example, you know? And we're not seeing the kind of results with somebody just fooling around with ayahuasca pharmalogs versus somebody with traditional Shipibo masters. What can they do? And so what are people healing from? Though there's a lot of research going into what's going on. I mean, I have a book about it, about all the cases and the relevant research around it. So I think there is something bigger than just like, you know, reconnecting with God, which is very important. The shamans there, the Shipibos, their attitude is, why is it that they're disconnected? We know the culture, we know the civilization, but what is it that's blocking them? And they feel like the block is what needs to be addressed. Once you unblock the person, it's intrinsic to the human being to enjoy and experience, you know, being an earthling on this planet.
So we're talking about William Burroughs.
Can I just quickly state that I don't actually want to sound like I'm demeaning traditional shamanism, because I have a tremendous amount of respect for shamanism in the correct context. I just feel the way it's being exported and commodified is not where it's at.
Let's look at that, because we live in a consumerist capitalist culture. But how do you inseminate a meme of like healing shamanic indigenous practices into a patriarchal, mechanistic, reductionist, like capitalist culture? I mean, it's got to transmit somehow. There's cultural vectors.
You're not going to. It's going to turn into a commodified Western thing.
Well,
unless you deal with the systemic, as David Nichol was saying this morning, unless you deal with the systemic problems, it's a Band-Aid situation. It's not a magic bullet, you know.
Well, I agree it's not a magic bullet, but there's definitely magic in it. And I think there's what people are seeing en masse, both through the multiple modalities of the entheogens available, is they find the healing they need and they reveal they are the medicine and there's all that within them. But what I'm saying is there's something primal and something very valuable about the shamanically mediated healing experience that the entheogens can bring within Western culture to perhaps be the antidote to the ego which has created the problems of Western culture.
Well, they're also quasi-legal, or more legal than, say, LSD. And I would argue we have 50 years of underground research with LSD now that if it was above ground and people could work with it properly in the correct surroundings, could be just as effective as any kind of ayahuasca shadow. Unfortunately, we've had these substances are here. We've already been playing around with them for quite a while now. We just keep circling around the wagons and kind of reinventing ourselves. I just see a lot of what's going on now already went on in the 60s. And
and the other real advantage of LSD is you can actually manufacture enough to turn on the world. If you tried to turn on the world with ayahuasca, you'd have to cut the whole Amazon down, you know? That's the reality. There's a lot of fucking people out there that need a stiff dose. No doubt about it. No doubt about it.
Well, we need a modernised version that's, part mystery school, part shamanic, part, I don't know, but I think we need to be creating new structures, not trying to fall back on old models, personally.
I think that goes back to what I was saying before, is that we're living in a time where we're in a process changing from the modern industrial kind of way of being human to a more relativistic, much more deeply emotionally connected and networked way of being human. And like any process, it doesn't just happen like that. You don't be this sort of way one day and that way the next day. When somebody presses a button, you've got to go through a process. And what happens during that process is the old systems slowly break down and they get to the point where they're no longer dominant, and that leaves space for the new systems to rise up and take over, the dominant role in society. And because we're right in the middle of that process right now, we ought to expect to see mixed modalities. We ought to expect to see people reaching back in time to some of these archaic modalities just to see if they work, or just to see if they provide some kind of a framework that we can adapt to what we need today. And in the process as well, we've got to remember we're not all going through that process at the same time, okay? You know, there isn't a group of people like this sitting outdoors having this discussion in every country in the world. Some countries you wouldn't find anything like this. And so we have to acknowledge that human diversity and acknowledge that some people will need a more traditional setting for them to be comfortable to go through a healing process, whereas other people might be quite happy just to do it, you know, in a very minimalistic setting with no ritual and still achieve useful effects. And I might also just add that I think the difference between healing and raising consciousness is really, you know, I think it's just really one spectrum. I think it's the same thing. Every time you heal yourself, you raise your consciousness in some way.
I would say look closely at yourself and what you want out of the experience. If you're addicted to something and you want to break an addiction, Ibogaine or some of these treatments are proven to be useful. So that's a good way to use it. If you have an illness and you think an ayahuasca shaman or going to Peru and working with a center can help treat your illness, by all means, follow that path. But if you're more interested in the psychedelic experience or the mystical experience, you know, you need a different kind of... I'm a great fan of the neutral container. I think especially if you're working with high dosage LSD or 5-methoxy-DMT or these things that really can significantly alter consciousness, then you want to have a neutral container where someone's just going to keep you safe and warm and make sure you don't hurt yourself and be able to put you in the recovery position if you throw up. But for the rest of it, they should leave you alone. You know, you don't want to... If you're looking for a mystical experience, don't go in there, don't mix the two up and think the person that's giving you this experience is, as they say in Zen, they mistake the finger that points at the moon for the moon. Like 5-methoxy-DMT is an extraordinarily powerful compound. And when you're in it, your body and your mind are completely separated. Your mind, your consciousness is in a different dimension. It has zero idea what's going back on there with your meat. Now, if I was an unethical practitioner, I could drag you around in a riverbed. I could pour water down your throat. I could shock you with a taser. I could do all kinds of things. You wouldn't know. And when you came out of it, because you've had this unitary experience, you'd be like, oh my God, that was so great. Thank you very much. But meanwhile, I've actually been abusing your body. To me, there's almost a kind of like psychedelic rape going on with some of these practitioners. And then some of the people that continue to support them are almost, to me, it's almost like a form of psychedelic Stockholm syndrome. I really am a big fan of the neutral container, and I think people should respect that. And the traditional shaman is not the problem. If you have a traditional shaman from a traditional culture that's grown up multi-generationally, they understand that. But it's the neo-shamans that seem to think that they can affect your experience and tail ending on the pipes and body manipulations and these things. That's really the antithesis of my view of what we should be encouraging.
So thank you, James. I agree. And I think that it also points to the fact that different entheogenic medicines have different needs and slightly different containers. So, for instance, the role of the curandero in an ayahuasca ceremony, as well as singing the icaros and bringing that energy in and focusing on the healing, is a very different steering role than potentially a 5-MeO practitioner who isn't a shaman but a practitioner or a space holder. There was some people say, 5-MeO culture is very rapidly proliferating and there's a lot of practitioners turning up. One of the streams, there was the Crossroads Clinic in Mexico that did Ibogaine and also worked with 5-MeO to fill the people once the Ibogaine had released the addiction and to fill them up again with that unitary experience. But most of, if not all of the practitioners there who work with the toad medicine were women, and essentially they were midwifing and they were providing a very safe space, a very intimate space for that death and rebirth, where they were held, it was contained, there was little or no interference, but there was a very perceptive quality of energy they would bring to the same energy if a baby's being born. And you don't want to electroshock a baby being born or pour water down its throat or anything like that. And there is a diversity of styles, but when the ego does get involved and projects into that space in that instance with that medicine, yeah, I don't think it may be appropriate. But with other medicines, it brings up the question I'll throw to the panelists, what is appropriate in mediating or helping people to their goals with the medicine, if that's healing or if that's whatever?
Well, do unto others is a pretty good start. And don't trash the joint, you know.
Well, you just already said that there's two different things. Are you there to be healed, or are you looking for a mystical experience? If you're looking for a mystical experience, neutral container. If you're there to be healed, then you put yourself in the hands of the healer. So to me, they're two very different things.
The psilocybin research that's happening in the USA has hard data on the fact that if you have a mystical experience, you're more likely to have a larger healing impact from the session. How do you explain that?
Well, I'm just saying they're not mutually exclusive. Like, what if you're not sick? What if you just want to hit? What if your interest is the mystical experience? Then why convince? You know, I just find it's a slippery slope.
Maybe well and sick are just too binary. What if there's this optimization? Exactly. What if there's more capacity we can grow
I know when
into?
I'm healthy and I know when I'm sick.
Why does it have to be a choice? This is the thing. Why is it one or the other? Why can't it be both? You know?
Yeah.
I just don't. I mean, I understand concrete sicknesses, like if you're actually healing cancers or you're healing, but this idea of these psychological sickness, then you're moving into therapy. You're moving into psychotherapy, which is another whole. I don't know. To me, it's a slippery slope, especially when everybody's calling everything a medicine all the time. I find that.
I disagree. I mean, I've had personal experiences where I have had significant healing of a psychedelic illness, in my case post-traumatic stress disorder, with zero therapy at all, just with the experience that I had from the medicine and listening to the music that came with it, and there was no therapist in the room, there was no talking.
Right, well that's kind of my point.
Precisely.
So what do I want to
do? I'm not saying you can't use these things for healing, I'm just saying, why is it always healing? You know, this we keep coming back to this idea that it's a healing thing, and I mean, I can see it in a broader sense. I just think they're two different questions.
It's a bit of a semantics issue. I just wanted to add, though, too, that this whole discussion is very difficult because it's easy to see from the outside somebody who's dressed up as a shaman, right? And sort of judge as to whether they're doing what they ought to be doing if they were a shaman. But the essence of that kind of work is not visible. And the essence of that kind of work is something that's internal to the practitioner, and it can't be taught. You can only teach so much in a practical, material world sense. It's a matter of a practitioner actually discovering within themselves whatever processes that they'll be using, to fulfill that role. And it makes it very difficult, I know, for people who are seeking healing, to make a judgment, particularly when they're not familiar with the psychedelic healing space, as to whether a practitioner knows their stuff or not. And it really comes down to what Joe said. It's about the outcomes. Talk to people who've been there and had the experience. How was it for them?
And then talk to them 5 or 10 years later and see how it worked in the long term.
I mean, just as a context, I've actually been visiting with traditional shamans for more than 30 years now.
Which ones?
I've been in Ecuador, I've been in Peru, I've been to the San Pedro shamans, I've done ayahuasca and Tarapoto in Ecuador, and in all the cases I've tried to get as far away from the Gringo Trail and as close to what seems to be, I'm fascinated by the whole concept, and I think shamanism can heal people. I just don't think that's what we're doing all the time.
So speaking of practitioners, there's been some consensus on the panel. The indigenous shamans are fine. We've got no problem with that. What do we feel about Westerners who... Many of them are sick. Many of them find healing. Some of them are drawn to working with the medicines that have helped heal them and to becoming anchor points in their community, whether you just call them shamanic facilitators. Hopefully none of them really run with the shaman term and get very ego-y about it. But this idea that the medicines who help heal want to keep spreading and want to keep transmitting through a new generation of Western practitioners. How do we feel about that?
But it's best to come up with a new name for it.
I
Because
agree.
as I said
think
first up,
we need a name.
it's just spiritual, cultural appropriation, and let's face it, the indigenous people of this planet, the tribal people of this planet, the First Nations people of this planet are kind of sick of that shit from us guys. You know, it's really time we stop playing that trip on them and just going, oh, wow, I really like that. I'll take that. Thanks. Now, we might not be intending to do that. We might be trying to be really gentle and appreciative and subtle and all that, but it's inherent in our fucking oblivious Western middle-class backgrounds that we're just going to walk all over them, same as we always do. So I just think we should, personally, this is my trip, and no blame if you don't want to do it. Put an Indian headdress on, go to Conchilla, fine. But personally, I don't really think it's cool. You know, and I think most Indigenous people, unless they're turning a buck off it themselves,
there's a big
will kind of agree with me.
Wearing a headdress and going to a festival and appropriating that, you know, that Native American stuff, and actually anchoring the responsibility and role of working with medicines and hopefully being guided by medicines to be a healer in your community. It's a whole different
Absolutely.
scale.
Just don't call it shamanism, and don't just hold us boulders, claim this ancient lineage or do what an awful lot of the neo-shamans do.
Lineages have got to start somewhere, and if we don't have one in the West, and it kick-started in the 60s, and it's like almost petered out, and it's coming around for another spiral, something is trying to work through us to mediate the community and to bring us into healing. And these plants, there's a larger process at work, and lineages have got to start somewhere.
Kids are still born that are interested in this stuff. You know, just because your culture, your civilization, how many kids are born into a culture where the role that they feel like they should be in isn't there? You know,
all of us here.
everyone here, right? Everybody here, right? So then this is the thing. It's like they have every right to be, you know, healers in the full capacity of what a human being, an earthling, can be.
Healers, yes.
Yeah,
Shaman,
or you know, under the other thing, shamans, whatever. Shaman is not a culture; it's an anthropological term, for a Siberian term that they put on them.
Yeah.
It's kind of
They didn't. You're not taking it from them.
Really.
It was never theirs. You know what I mean? It's just like
It is like the global term.
My
because
thing
no
is
one
just
else
like
wants it.
leave them out of it for a little while, you know, and talk about yourselves, because it's like you're talking about all these people. What do they think about it, and how do they think, and what they think? You don't know what they think. You know, I'm working with them. They're very excited. The ones, my friends, are very excited that people's shamanism is growing and that there's an interest in shamanism in the world, because they see their environment and their ecosystem is threatened. And so they think, wow, okay, these people are starting to remember the natural healing, the natural medicine, and maybe the psychedelics are helping them do that. So I'm saying there's that side of it that I think I get it. You know, we want to warn people away from being insensitive, but there's a major insensitivity just in the basic of like, you don't even ask an Indian person what they think about it. You know, it's like, I don't know. I live with them. They're very excited about what's going on. You know what I mean? They're not upset that people are wearing Shipibo clothes here. It's an honor. It's a matter of dignity, like for their culture that has been so suppressed and overlooked by their own people in Peru forever. And now the white people have come and given them a little bit of credit and an interest and an economic pathway towards participating in the society.
Yeah.
You
So
know,
how do they feel about Westerners who train with other Kurundios, like you yourself did? How do they feel about
I
that
train.
lineage?
I train. So I have the lineage, and so he wants me to go out. You know, and so somebody else might disagree with that. You shouldn't do that.
How long did
He's
you
telling
train?
me I should do it.
How long did you train for?
I trained for 7 years, 6 years.
I'm impressed. That's
Okay,
cool. I've
so
got a
I
friend,
worked
I've got a friend
5
that married into a shamanic
Right.
thing in Ecuador in the 80s,
Yeah.
and he lived there for 20 years.
I mean, I did, and so I think that's very real, and I think people need to take that very seriously. So that is a big point that I would bring to the situation. It's like, yeah, I trained, you know, 5 years intensely, 6 to 8 months of the year, 4 ceremonies a week, you know, and I think there is something to be said with training alongside a master, and I think there are things you can learn from that practice. It's not all self-discovery. There's a whole lot of guidance you can receive about what can be done and what can't be done, and that's what they gained from their parents, grandparents, etc. There's a lot of knowledge to be gained from, you know, training under someone, and not everyone has that opportunity, but I do think that's really important, and for people to realize, like you said, I mean, you're seeing this neo-shamanic ayahuasca practice. Yeah, you're right. They don't know what they're doing, a lot of them. And so you're not going to see the potential of that medicine. It looks like nothing because they haven't really done that much with it. But there's a whole lot more you can do with it, you know, and so that's just ayahuasca shamanism. I mean, there's all these other things you're talking about. And it's a very personal thing, you know, it's very personal. Ayahuasca is not going to be the right thing for the whole world, and not everyone should do ayahuasca and all the rest of it. It's very personal what you go to. But I think that these young people, Australians, wherever part of the world they're from, some of them are sincerely interested in shamanic healing as a life path because they feel called to it and it resonates with their heart. And I would just say, if that's your story, go ahead, but learn as much as you can. You don't get ahead of yourself. Don't BS people. You know, keep your integrity. You don't have to lie to people. Just claim this bullshit.
So do we feel that some of the energy and the charge around neo-shamanism isn't the fact that, well, the word itself triggers, but as you were just saying, the lineage or the putting the practice into practice, like have these people done enough practice where indigenous people may study for 10, 20 years with ayahuasca, different lineages with different medicines have specific roles for initiation at different times, but in the West, as we absorb this, Neil's right, it becomes commodified, it becomes retrofitted, it becomes fast-tracked, and are the dangers in the way we're using these tools, but not the tools or the potential new lineage itself? Is it the way we're doing it, you feel?
I think you got to expose those shamans that are doing it in this, half-baked way. Expose them. Like, that's not what, how much did you train, how much did you, and then there may be prodigies among them that are doing all these miracles, but that community is going to be the one to tell you that. It's hard because it's illegal, so where does this information transpire? Yeah. But it's very personal, so you need a personal recommendation, and it needs to be, like, tight in the community.
Being a part of a traditional indigenous shamanic tradition, lineage doesn't make someone free from human behavior. So I think it should be noted that when we, as Westerners, inject large amounts of money into impoverished communities, those communities are changing. Absolutely. And the behavior of an individual doesn't necessarily reflect all shamans or that tradition. It reflects the behavior of that individual as a human being who's fallible.
Well, there's many irresponsible shamans in Peru, in the Amazon, all over South America. There's a lot of jerks, there's sexual predators, there's charlatans. All the same things you're worried about here with these people are happening there and have been happening for centuries. That's something you have to educate people about, the reality. This issue about injecting money into South America, and that's a bad... Well, if you guys were worried about that, you should have worried about that a long time ago when you went over there to get gold and all this other junk. It's like this idea that, my family's from Colombia, that the West and America and all these people actually care about, like, what's going on economically in South America all of a sudden. Like, if you're so worried about exposing them to money culture, well, there's like a million times. Maybe you shouldn't have bought cocaine. I don't know, whenever that was. You know what I mean? There's about 1,000 times you could have said it. So then I get back to that point. It's like this argument that you're concerned about them. You're not. Stop saying you're concerned about them because you don't like ayahuasca tourism. If you cared about them, you would have done something for one of them by now.
Well,
I think part of the point is that the ayahuasca tourism is in some way perverting it. I mean, when I first met Rack, he was trying to expose ayahuasca tourism at that point. Now he's a propagandist. But I think we're getting back to the same point I've been trying to make throughout the whole thing. Like, a real shaman on a healing mission is very different to somebody who's taking psychedelics to a group. And if you actually were like, drop the shaman label and was like, I've got the best psychedelic experience of your life, it's called ayahuasca, who wants to sign up? I think that's more honest than a lot of what we've got going on, where people are convincing themselves that they're going to do something different, where really what they're interested in is the psychedelic experience.
Yeah, there's a generation of psychonauts, right? And it's like, what is that? It's like psyche, mind-opening naut, like astronaut going in, exploring it. But it's very individual. It's very disconnected. There's an online community of psychonauts that we're all maybe part of, and here we are in the flesh as well. But where's the group ritual? Where's the togetherness? Where's the circle and the ritual that the shamanic lineages give us?
There are lots of groups around the world that create their own circles and their own structures, and they've been doing it ever since the 60s.
Make your circle.
Lots of groups.
Get some land.
They're called mates.
Live with your friends. Live with your family. That's your community.
Well, that's good. That's ritual.
And within that community, there'll be somebody who's really good at brewing shit up,
So this is the differentiation I mean, forget the word shaman, but it's like a flock of geese. Like, who's leading? And maybe there is no leader. And maybe what this is pointing towards is that at some point in time, when all the indigenous tribes of the world had their own direct experience of gnosis through plant medicines or just being plugged in more, maybe there wasn't a shaman. Maybe everyone was the shaman and there is no shaman. And maybe that's where we're in the delivery birth canal of coming through this mediated role, which someone usually on the edge of the village had to take it on board, the brunt of like freaking hell, I'm going to hold this space for everyone else so they can go off and do the village thing. And it's been a point in time, but maybe we're seeing the proliferation of plant medicines and now 5-MeO-DMT and N-DMT, which are endogenous and point towards, our own ability to connect to our own medicine, that maybe there's a full circle happening where hopefully the role of the shaman is going to phase itself out through the healing of the masses.
I think the shaman is in the village community, in these small communities, who's a shaman. There's people who are more interested in that stuff, and they spend more time with that than everybody else. And so that's who does it. You know what I mean? It's like that. That's right. It's like there's somebody that they all went to the ayahuasca ceremony, and then one of the kids is like, oh, I want to go to the next one, and they really enjoy it, and they get into it. So they do that, and they refine. There's somebody else that was building the huts. For somebody else, it was this.
Or the musician,
so it's as a musician. So these are things that people are born into, and so that's where it comes from. And so I think this, I don't know, what I'm getting from this is like, we want to promote honesty. We want to promote integrity, and these people that are claiming to be part of that, and that's so important, and so we could just drop the facade and just really strive for that, that's what I think that's what the world and the community needs.
And depending on the modality, sometimes there's a very, very real need for somebody to be watching over what's going on, and particularly in the world ayahuasca community, the modern community, there've been many incidents and unfortunately a few deaths from people who just haven't been looked after, who may have choked on their own vomit or ended up in some place where they shouldn't have been and been injured or in some cases killed. So just in a practical sense, sometimes depending on the depth of the altered state, you really need somebody just watching over what's going on. And it might just be a sitter, but it might also be somebody who has the background and the relevant skills to be able to assist in a metaphysical way as well.
A modern sitter would be a registered nurse who knows how to put you in the recovery position.
And maybe someone who knows how to, if you're having a hard time, remind you to breathe or dangle a crystal in front of your eyes.
Got a good music collection.
A good music collection or can play music. That'd be even better maybe, real music rather than just a fucking 16-bit CD.
Okay, we've got some time for some questions from the audience. Do anyone want to come up to, there's an open mic here.
In my experience, I've had really good experiences with what I like to call helpful, largely benevolent drug enthusiasts or plant enthusiasts in this country. I've had great experiences with traditional healers. But insofar as somebody who goes overseas and, drinks 30 or 40 times and comes back over here and I'm a shaman and it's $400 for a weekend. I mean, in the 60s, as this gentleman says, you got the acid family, they have a tradition, they make 70 cents, $1 off an experience. Where's that? What's going on there? It's shrouded in mysticism and spirituality.
We all got busted, he said, yeah.
And it's, it should, the people that really care, it's free. And that's what we need to see more of in Australia, that commitment. And if we label people as an enthusiast and define their personality traits, we can understand who the good people are that can help us. What do you guys think about that?
Enthusiast as the thing? Like an ayahuasca enthusiast or
for a white person in Australia.
I think what he said is pretty true. I got no problem with what you're doing.
To you too.
I got no problem. I think you're doing really good work, but you're not. You're not like you're not putting on the. You're not pretending to be what you're not.
What should also be pointed out, Joe was a doctor before he trained to be a shaman, so he's staying within his tradition of being interested in being a medical person. To me, that makes total sense. If I was a Western doctor and I wanted to explore modalities of healing, I would look to that direction too. But I'm not a doctor, I'm a mystic. I'm interested in a very different thing. And so I just find that there's the mystical element of psychedelics is getting mixed up in this medical element of the side.
Isn't getting high good for you?
Yep.
Yeah.
It starts us, brother.
We think, for most people,
So, look, someone on a previous panel said this idea that, you shouldn't charge money for being a healer or a shaman, whatever, and indigenous cultures don't do it. But it's always about an energy exchange. It doesn't have to be the money. In our capitalist consumer society, we've got this money energy. But, what I see happening is as it goes from Peru and South America and their communities, which still get paid, even if it is an energy exchange, and they say that a good curandero should never say no to someone who needs healing. But it doesn't mean there's not going to be an energy exchange, or you give them a chicken, or you look after them, or you fix the roof or something.
What do you think about the idea of not even playing the hierarchical guru
I think it's
role?
a great
idea. The more you share that responsibility around, and one person isn't, as you say, the focus of attention, then that's going to be the better for everybody.
I actually also feel that the future of both psychedelic and entheogenic work is like collectivism, like psychic collectivism on that level, and supporting each other, and the group mind, the whole Kesey thing, the hive mind.
The pranksters, there's a great example.
It's evolutionary. I think all these peak experiences individually are freeing us up to hold the circuit collectively to bring in that level of consciousness back into our ability. Collectivism, yeah. Questions? One or two more.
There's something to say?
That's okay.
We got a comment?
Rachel, go.
I was just going to say, it looks like we're all in agreement that moving towards self-responsibility, it naturally makes sense. And I think during that transition, because we're not a very self-responsible society in ways, the very nature of a government represents our lack of self-responsibility. During that transition, if we can focus on authenticity and transparency, so if somebody's charging $6,000 and that seems like a lot of money, just ask them what their costs are. And I think if we focus on transparency, you can quite easily, that pressure will you can just make clearer choices. We'll be able to make clearer choices.
And, a lot of our problems are because these substances are illegal.
Right.
So we're having to work underground and in the shadows, and you don't have the same transparency that you might have if these were more legalized, I think.
That would be the central issue, because ultimately it's so personal how people want to work with all this stuff, and because of the illegality and everyone's trying to find some cause to get behind, to promote it, like who's doing the right way. If it was legal, everyone would be doing it however they wanted to do it and explore it. And so again, the central issue is the legal,
Yeah.
Questions, anyone?
Hello. This has been by far the most interesting and exciting and adrenaline pumping panel in the last couple of days. So thank you very much for that. I think we are kind of forgetting in this discussion to remember that shamans, healers, however you want to call them, they're spokesmen for the plants. And if we look at it from this perspective, I know that there's a lot of issues with the commodification and commercialization of, for example, ayahuasca, peyote, blah, blah, blah. But what if this is exactly what the plants want and what the plants need in order to reach more people, to reach people like us that can also then start a, like a domino effect with all the people around us. That's... Maybe that's what they're trying to do to bridge that disconnect. I'd like to know if you have any thoughts about that. And thank you very much.
I think that just as traditional indigenous peoples are representatives of the plants, we too are representative of the plants because we're human and we live on Earth and we share this home as a collective space. So I just wouldn't limit that responsibility just to indigenous people because plants own plants, not people owning plants.
Yeah, and I agree with that 100%. It's for everybody. It's the planet Earth, and no matter what, whatever sour attitudes people might have about what's going on, it's happening. So it's like kind of an armchair criticism of what's happening. This is what's happening. It is spreading, whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea, or what's driving it, but it's spreading right now, and there are a lot of positive things are coming from that, and there's kind of there's risks and there's warnings, and we need to be careful, and it's not, there's a whole list of things we need to be careful about and not be naive and all that stuff, and speak from integrity and be honest about risks that are out there and not kind of make it seem so sweet and nice, when it's not. But it's growing, and for me, it's a positive thing. I'm not ashamed to be, one of those people that's out there spreading this. And I do feel that, in my personal ayahuasca relationship, I'm encouraged,
I think the motto of EGA is "In plants we trust," isn't it? Remember? Hey, they're helping us to remember who and what we really are, what we're embedded in, connected to. So, maybe there is a larger force at work mediated through the plant. The planet has a plan involving the plants, I think a good friend of ours once said.
I would point out the fact that all this actually began 70 years ago with the synthesis of LSD, and that this culture needed LSD to bring it back to the plants. So I find the synthetic versus natural argument. I think consciousness is using all the means possible to get in contact with us. Traditionally, that's been with plants. Our addition to modern or to psychedelic culture is we've now created synthetics, which are more marketable and more distributable. So my argument would be, consciousness is what's trying to get in touch. It's not necessarily the consciousness of plants.
Got time for one last question for the panel, please. Step on up.
Hey, so I wanted to ask about what it practically looks like to protect. How am I going to put this? So we're in this underground, sort of not mainstream thing, and there's people like these neo-shamans that we want to warn people about, but a lot of people don't know about them, especially newcomers. And I want to ask, what do you think it looks like for us as a community to help new people coming in who don't know who these people are, who don't know what's good for them? What does that look like?
You know, there's a lot of Facebook groups, and you may laugh, but I mean, they provide containers and spaces for community discussion. And there's that new Buffo Gangsters page, which is talking about some of the Buffo gangsters. There's many shamanic ayahuasca pages which want to create a space for people to have peer review and talk about their experiences. So in terms of information and community, the community powwow, you know, the space where people talk about what they've been through and have peer review on practitioners is online globally, really.
I've never seen that, and I've been in this scene for like 6 years, and I'm fully aware that there's people who are being protected by other people in the community.
I think you just have to call it out whenever you can. Whenever you see it, call it out. I mean, like, Rack mentioned India in the 60s before, and like, I mean, I've done a lot of time in India, or not jail time. But
and what happens when you call it out and nobody else backs you up? And I've got bros here, my friends, who are still like friends with people who are known sexual predators.
Look, I know, but that... No excuse. No, I don't know there's much I can offer. As a culture, I mean, I'm not talking about the neo-shamanic culture, I'm talking about the Western culture. We're just starting to broach that one, aren't we? It's only just coming out. I don't know. I think just hold your ground, continue calling it out. The people that get it, and they'll come to back you up sooner or later, but then, I mean, it's a messy business. Like, people are fucking weak,
you
basically.
Gotta let them go.
And this is a very, very, very scene-based scene.
Well, as an
so
underground...
if you're not cool, you're not going to get in. If someone's cool and they're a predator, half the people are going to turn a blind eye to it. That's just a fucking sad fact of reality. So you've got to be strong. If I think I'm real, I've got to be strong. Anyone that sees it needs to call it out. That's all I can really say, and that's I don't know. Sorry, I can't offer more. You know, sorry.
As an underground culture, we have to be self-policing. You know, but luckily we do have social media and more tools at our hands, certainly than they had in the 60s. You know, I think if you're interested in working with a shaman or a self-proclaimed mystic or whoever, do your due diligence. There's plenty of information available, mostly ask around, ask other people's experiences. Don't just be like, you know, I think a lot of people go to these people because they want to try ayahuasca, they want to try 5-methoxy-DMT. They don't necessarily go to the person because they want to train under that person. That's just the person that has the magic bullets. So, I mean, maybe don't let your own desire overcome common sense. In that case, do your own due diligence.
Yeah, I think it's all about strength and community, but, you know, there's two aspects to that. I mean, there's the other people in the community and there's you, right? And it's all about being connected and being honest, and also being connected to yourself and being honest with yourself. And if you find yourself in the middle of a community that's dishonest or protecting sexual predators, you really need to ask yourself, what am I doing there, right?
Who are my friends?
That's really important. You know, that's where it stops. That's where it stops, and that's where the safer place opens up. I was connected to a shaman that, you know, I learned, oh wow, this guy's been doing stuff. You know, and they had all the excuses and everybody and how powerful and how talented and oh, he's just a rock star, and you just hear all these excuses. But I just couldn't be associated with that myself, you know? So I had to just walk away. Like, why would I stick around there? I just can't. I can't do that myself, you know. And and so then we were able to, I was with other people, build this other community where that kind of safety was a priority. You know, we said, you know, that's what we don't want to be around. So that's this new community. And there's plenty of people right here probably that you could run into to help you work that out. But I mean, you do have to draw a line.
You know, I think we're seeing that with the centralization of authority in the Me Too movement, and the fact that these hierarchical, usually patriarchal figures are now being called on it, and there's a momentum and there's a movement of transparency and of the shadow coming up. And so I think shamanic culture is seeing that as well and questioning that shamanic archetype of the shaman, just like we question the politicians and the leaders and the CEOs. So thank you so much for your contribution, for all the questions. We are going to have to wrap this up. This is an endless ball of quantum string. I'd like to thank all the panelists, Neil Pike, James Oroc, Joe Tufor, Rachel and Steve McDonald. This has been Gurunation, Shamans in the Global Village. And perhaps as the psychonauts and the shamans merge, we can have a generation of shamanauts, and we can all self-mediate our own experiences.
Shamanaut is good. I like Shamanaut.
Yeah, and thanks, Rakrazam. Yeah, that was a pretty meaty, punchy sort of...